Здравствуйте! Сегодня в гостях у программы «Час Спик» джазовый музыкант, профессор и руководитель Центра джаза и популярной музыки в университете Натал Darius Brubeck. Hello, Darius.
Hello, Nikita.
Darius, how often do you visit Russia, our country, and do you like Russia?
This is my very first visit to Russia. I have been here slightly less than 24 hours, and I've loved every minute of it because I'm in a beautiful hotel in central Moscow, and the view is terrific. People are great. But let me say, I've been looking forward to visiting Russia for many, many years. This is something I wanted to do, virtually all my life, and I'm so glad to be here.
Your father, legendary musician, jazz musician, Dave Brubeck, he visited our country in late 80s. What did he told you about Russia and the Soviet Union?
He actually visited more than once, but the very famous situation, that visit that you're talking about, was with a very high-level American delegation, including President Ronald Reagan, who met directly with your president at the time, if I'm saying it right, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And that was to negotiate, to set a limit on arms. In English, we referred to that as SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which was very important because, in effect, that was the end of the Cold War. The consequences came a bit later, but from then on, it was clear both sides were reaching out to each other. They were looking for peace, something even better than détente, perhaps even friendly relations. Negotiations on both sides were a little stiff. They were formally correct, but they weren't reaching agreement completely because there wasn't trust. For an agreement, you need trust. And when in the banquet at Spaso House, which was hosted by the US government, invited the Soviet delegation, the Dave Brubeck Quartet provided the entertainment. And as soon as they started playing, both sides kind of relaxing, kind of grooving with the music. And you just see it in the body language, you see it in the posture. Okay, we're having a nice dinner together. The music's cool. We're all in the same room. We all have the same purpose, Russians or Americans. And now maybe we trust each other because they've seen the humanity that they both have by responding to the music the way they did. And some of the American diplomats spoke to Dave afterwards and said this really did make a difference.
It's a very interesting moment that during these negotiations, the jazz musicians were invited, not classical music, not rock music, but jazz.
Yes.
Why do you think the jazz should be played during these so hard negotiations?
Well, there's several reasons for that. Okay, reason number one is that someone from the White House did ask the Gorbachevs what American music they knew and liked, and he mentioned Dave Brubeck by name. So he didn't just say jazz, he said Dave Brubeck. Somehow that had reached him. So he'd stated a preference, and of course, the Mr. and Mrs. Reagan, President and Mrs. Reagan, wanted to oblige him, and it was easy to do that. because my father always wanted to have this role of bringing peace and bridging cultures. The reason for jazz rather than classical music, I think, had to do with the fact that this was an American banquet. That was the event. So perhaps if it were a Russian banquet, you would have had a virtuoso pianist playing Rachmaninoff or something like that. But the American side wanted to show the best of what we have, what we have as a nation that has been universally accepted, just like your Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, Prokofiev, etc.
But during the Soviet period, jazz music was prohibited in the Soviet Union. So in our newspapers, we could read some phrases like today you're playing jazz and tomorrow you will sell your motherland. Do you think that this jazz concert meant the changing in the relationship, the improvement of the relationship between our countries?
Yes, of course. That's a very strong signal. And there was something called Voice of America, which broadcast from 1956, actually from the time of the Hungarian Revolution, if I may say so, from 1956 onward into Russian satellite countries. So, yes, saying if you listen to jazz, you would sell out your motherland is like saying you're being corrupted by Western culture. If you allow that to invade your consciousness, you're not really striving for a socialist victory, for a worldwide workers' paradise. But when jazz is accepted, then it is an acceptance, not necessarily of westernization, but of liberalization, of cultural freedom, of individuality, of the idea that each person can make an individual contribution, not just be part of the proletariat moving forward to build an ever more rational society. Jazz musicians are all kinds of people, but in my friendship circle and amongst the people my father knew, most of us are pretty far to the left of where America is. We have a different outlook in general. So we're not more capitalist, but we're not selling out our motherland either.
Was your father proud of this mission? What did he tell you about that day, that negotiations, his impressions?
He was very proud. It's interesting. Okay, we're in political territory. By instinct and by tradition, we've been Democrats. But on the other hand, my father and Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and my mother had a pretty easy rapport because they all had a Californian upbringing or a Californian background. My father grew up on a ranch. He knew what it was to spend every day on horseback. The world outlook wasn't that different, and the mission was to not only to ensure there would not be a catastrophic nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union, it would also enable both countries to redirect those resources into areas that would benefit our own societies a lot more than building up a nuclear arsenal which would never be used. So, and I must say that this is a long answer, but my father was always an internationalist. Yes, an American, a Californian, but he had a vision of the world as a whole, and that any communication, any cultural exchange, any political accord would be good. And he learned this the hard way by being a soldier in World War II. He was that old. He was in the US Army during the European campaign, but he wasn't there to kill Germans. He was he was there because
he served his land.
Yeah, that's right. And he hated war. He hated the consequences of war. He hated the destruction. But he'd seen how far people can go, can just lose their values, can lose their moral direction once nationalism gets too stirred up. And he once told me that it was very upsetting, especially in terms of all the nations involved were being Christian countries, and this was so contrary to any of the beliefs.
So we have told before, we interviewed about the jazz diplomacy.
Yes.
So we know that during the whole Cold War, Ronald Reagan had named the Soviet Union the Empire of Evil. And do you think that this jazz diplomacy could have changed this statement a little bit?
I don't know if that would have changed the rhetoric at the time, the evil empire. What did you guys call us?
You know, our propaganda told us that Americans live in poverty, but all of us knew that, not all, but many of us knew that it's not truth. And of course, some of us heard the Voice of America, the Radio of Freedom, and so on, and rock music and jazz music and so on. So we knew that our propaganda lies, but we knew also that Americans are enemies for us because of this statement, because of the Ronald Reagan's Empire of Evil.
Yeah.
So the jazz diplomacy, has it changed the situation? How could music change the relations between two countries?
I used the word trust earlier,
Yep.
Or rapport, humanity. It comes down to individuals, and it can be many individuals that. But what I experienced in Poland, I was in Poland in 1958 as a 10-year-old boy. My parents wanted me, and I had a younger brother then, Michael, who's died since then, but there were 4 of us on the road, plus the Dave Brubeck Quartet. And my parents wanted me to see another side of life, and they trusted, quite rightly, that we would be well taken care of, as well as people were able to do. When the Polish people saw that the famous Dave Brubeck from America, a big star, trusted them enough to bring 2 sons and his wife on the road, they were very moved by that. So, you know, if I trust you, you will trust me. So that overcomes some of the negative propaganda, some of the negative rhetoric.
Jazz brings trust?
I think so, because people, so already looking around you, other people are coming into the concert, you have this in common, and you're taking a little bit of a chance. You're taking a chance because the jazz music, by its nature, is improvisational. You know, there can be brilliant nights and maybe not so brilliant, but you know that the musicians and the audience are going to make an effort together to reach a high level of emotional connection. So you can't do that if you're very reserved, if you're not willing to give yourself to the stage and to be part of an audience, to be part of that experience. You just simply won't get it. So in that sense, I think jazz does bring trust.
So the Soviet Union is broken for 30 years, but have you got some stereotypes about Russia? Before you have visited it, yes, for the first time, did you think that we are drinking vodka all the time, or I don't know, about the bears walking through Moscow streets?
Yeah, I suppose so. I think from, you know, and I'm only saying what I know from other sources, not from direct experience. So please don't be offended. But I see Russia from abroad as being very authoritarian. You know, that is very much managed from the Kremlin and stereotypes. Okay, that Russians overseas, I'm not talking about Russians in Russia, Russians in London, Russians in New York, in Greece, in Israel, wherever they are, they're probably gangsters. They're probably doing international...
Mafia.
Yeah, mafia stuff. And so you just stay away from them. If you see a restaurant that has Cyrillic writing in front and a few guys standing around in expensive leather jackets and a Ferrari and a Rolls-Royce parked, you don't want to go near there. So those are the stereotypes I image now. Not so much the communist thing. I'm old enough that I remember that, but I think a lot of younger people wouldn't know. You know, Stalin is a historical figure. They wouldn't think of Russia in terms of that legacy, but they think more in terms of the very wealthy nomenclature, the bankers, the mafia, the Abramovich, you know, owning Chelsea. You know, how someone just shows up and buys a football team from, oh, come on. You know, how did he do that? It's...
Did you know Paul Desmond?
Very well. Uncle
Tell
Paul.
us about him. He's very popular here.
Until I don't know what age, but growing up, I thought he was my real uncle, that he was my father's brother because they were such good friends. And he came to the house a lot with his saxophone, and they would play together and talk about music and talk about many other things. But their musical relationship was very important in the days of the classic Dave Brubeck quartet. But Paul was unlike my father in other ways. I'm one of 6 children. I'm the eldest of 6. And my father married once and for all. My mother was 19 when they got married in 1942. Uncle Paul had some very nice girlfriends, but never married. He was a bachelor. And maybe that's what made him close to our family. We were kind of like a family for him. He was very clever, very urbane. He was, if I can use that term, he was a real urban, sophisticated guy, you know. A very good chess player. He belonged to a chess club in New York. Very good photographer. And he liked to hang out with people like Woody Allen. You know, he was in that world, whereas my father really felt he was happiest when he was at home. But when they got together musically, it was magic.
In Wikipedia, I have read that you studied not only music, but also the history of religions in
right.
the University of Wesley. So these disciplines are, for me, they are very unlike, like your father and Paul Desmond. Why did you mention, why did you choose the history of religions? How music and religions are connected in your mind?
Well, first of all, every religion well, I can't say every, but most religious traditions have music as a very important part of it. If you go to a church service, or you or a synagogue or a Hindu shrine, wherever you go, the music is part of that experience, and it's part of what binds that community. You know, they have their own sound. You can play a few seconds of a Russian Orthodox service.
Have you heard our services?
Yeah, on recording. And also I was in Romania for a while, which is very similar. Not the language, but the liturgy. I did ethnomusicology, the study. It's like anthropology and music combined. But that led me more and more to think, well, behind this, or supporting these musical traditions, are other kinds of traditions too. And all of them have to do with community, search for meaning, search for higher values in life, and music is an expression that goes along with this very often.
And what about jazz? Is jazz connected to religion?
Yes, very often, but not explicitly. Let's say part of the whole feel does come from church, from gospel church, from the black churches. Just, you know, a terrific way of a great feel. You know, a lot of the swing feel actually comes from that. Dizzy Gillespie talked about how much that influenced his music. Most of the jazz musicians I know are curious about life, are curious about questions that religion addresses. Some of them think they will find the answer by joining a specific religion. For example, Herbie Hancock is a Nichiren Shoshu Buddhist. Quite a few African Americans have become Muslim. You know, names come to mind like Rashid Ali, Ahmad Jamal, South African pianist Abdullah Ibrahim.
Muhammad Ali?
Muhammad Ali was a boxer. I met him, by the way.
Yeah?
Yeah.
He likes jazz.
Yes, yes. He loved Take Five.
Everyone likes Take Five.
Yeah. Yeah, we were backstage because he was going to be a guest on a TV show like this, and I was also going to be a guest. I was there with my father and brothers, and we were introduced, and then he kind of acted out, "Oh, Take Five, boom, boom, ba-doom, boom, 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 ba-doom, boom, boom, boom." He liked, whether there is a religion that you can name or not involved. Like Dave O'Higgins, the sax player in my quartet, says very strongly that he's a complete atheist. So he doesn't believe in any kind of religion at all. But still, within music, there's a very strong quest for, again, the two things I mentioned, community and meaning. And I think we're all just very open-minded, and so that kind of links jazz and religion. Religion doesn't always have to divide people. I know since September 11th, 2001, we think of religion the way we thought of it during the days of the Crusades in the 12th century, but religion also can be an individual quest for meaning, and you find it in many places if you're open-minded. And even being an atheist is kind of...
You know, for me, jazz is like a religion because it unites a lot of people with different way of thinking, with different gods, but it's a close society. And people who love jazz, they hear only jazz, not rock, not classical music, but they like jazz. Do you feel when you are playing jazz like a priest, like a bachelor?
In the best moments, it can be like that, but you have to think of it maybe in a different way. If you're in a congregation, you see the priest is someone who's in a way directing the liturgy. So in a way, he's the boss at that moment in time. But on the other hand, if you're on stage, or if you're on the altar, if you're the priest or the imam or whatever, it's not about that. It's not about how you dominate the situation. It's about what you bring in, what you're channeling through you. So it can be like being a priest, but in that particular way, as a channel.
Let's talk about Africa. I know that
yes.
You worked in Africa. You were a professor in the university, yes? Tell us at first, how did you decide to leave for Africa, and what did you do there for so long time?
Okay, the first thing you should know is that my wife, Catherine, is a South African, although we met in New York. So automatically there was a connection. I went there because there was an opportunity to start a jazz education program for the first time at a university in South Africa. In fact, there was no other formal jazz degree in the whole of Africa. Now, this seems very ironic.
Yes, very strange.
Because there would be no jazz in America if Africans hadn't come to America. But on the other hand, the colonial structure that existed up until the period I'm talking about would have discouraged that, because it would have shown black people as powerful. It would have shown black people as achieving international recognition, of having
fighting a party.
Yeah, artistic and intellectual potential. And the apartheid system was based on a white minority ruling over a black majority. I'm putting it very simply, but that's kind of it.
I'm sorry, but your wife is not black, she's white.
Yeah,
yes?
yeah, she's white. But Catherine was a political dissident against the regime, which is part of the reason why we met in New York, that she was working against that. She worked on boycotting South African goods. She was friendly with a lot of the politicians in exile, a lot about South Africa, and a lot about politics from my wife, because I didn't have to be so politically involved as an American.
As an American musician.
Yeah, American musician at the time. But it was irresistible to start something that should exist for the first time. You know, to be at the beginning of something. There was no predecessor. There was no mold I had to fit into, and I had a lot of confidence that it would work. Now, why is that? Because the reason is that South Africans had a very active jazz scene. It wasn't like I was bringing jazz to South Africa. It was more like I was giving it a strong endorsement by saying, this is worth studying at a university. This is something you can learn formally. And it was a way at the same time of transforming the university as an institution.
Another kind of jazz diplomacy.
Very much so. You made the link very well. And if I may say so, there's a movie that's being made about me and Catherine called Playing the Changes. And the way that started was that David Richardson wanted to send a documentary team to cover the tour of Poland, which was in November 2018. And then my next big overseas trip earlier this year was going to be South Africa in 2019. And we began talking about this, and we realized there is this link. It's another form of jazz diplomacy. It's not official, as in the case with Poland, but there is a link. It's bringing jazz, bringing change, a very peaceful way, and in fact, an entertaining way. I don't want to make it sound so deadly serious. The point, first of all, is that the music should be enjoyed and appreciated, but somehow this process does bring change.
So you brought changes on your back to Africa, and how did Africa change you?
I really learned how important music can be through that experience, through living in South Africa for 23 years and living through really pretty desperate, violent times. Then the transition, 1994. And then after. And the thread that runs through all of this is the way music connected people. In this case, you could say under apartheid, it had kind of a virtue of, again, I use the word trust coming back,
yes,
of connecting black and white people who also like jazz.
Trust is the key word of our interview.
Yeah, and it surprises me. I haven't given that so much thought before. But people going to a jazz club, sitting together, are not expecting that someone's going to put a knife in your back, you know, if you're just sitting there grooving, or that you will be a racist if you're appreciating if you're white and appreciating a black musician, or vice versa. So jazz clubs were a very important way for people to show that they were not enemies if they were not. You know, the other people stayed away, but there was also an audience for jazz clubs and for jazz festivals. Oh, and then the other thing is that it connected generations, because you have jazz was something that was handed to younger people by their elders. So every youth generation has its own music, and that will be the most popular music at the time, the most popular for dancing, usually. But jazz had a sort of continuity, so, and also the careers of jazz musicians last a long time, you know. So, for instance, I often have been in a situation where I'll see some quite young people at a concert, and I'll be a little surprised, because I don't think of my audience as being student age or whatever, but the reason they're there is because it's their grandfather's birthday and they've brought him or something. So it's trust between generations that somehow also embodies a little bit of the liberal values that we're talking about and the humanitarianism. But above all, they like the music. You know, we have to keep coming back to the music.
You mentioned changes. The jazz is changing.
Yeah.
What do you think is the future of jazz? For example, 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, I have heard the word acid jazz for the first time, new jazz and so on. What is the future of jazz? What it will be like in maybe 10, 20 years?
Oh, okay. The easy answer is I really don't know. But I don't expect any aspect of any part of jazz to really disappear. It gets added to. It's not like you erase the slate every time something new comes along. So, you know, what we consider traditional jazz will be there in 10 or 15 years. Look, the music that I'll be playing tomorrow is so different from the music of, say, Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton.
And Dave Brubeck?
No, it's not so different from the music of Dave Brubeck, but it's not the same. So, you know, it's an evolutionary process and a process of accumulation. At jazz history, we might think of the swing era or the modern jazz era, you know, of Dave, you know, with the big names being Dave Brubeck, Miles Davis, then maybe avant-garde going from Coltrane forward. We tend to put these in periods, which is okay, as we say, you know, Baroque, Romantic, etc., with classical music. But it's always individuals who make the difference. It always really is a John Coltrane or a Miles Davis, or I think for big band music today, Maria Schneider, you know, has brought something that's really new and refreshing. But it never overthrows, it never deletes what came in the past. It's always a platform moving forward, and it's always individuals who do this. There isn't just suddenly a new era.
And do you know Russian jazz musicians, except Igor Budman? He is very popular. Have you ever played with Russian jazzers?
No, I haven't.
But do
if
you want
said,
to?
Okay, but if you ask me the same question, have I played with
Dutch.
German? Yeah,
German.
Dutch. Okay, fine. No, because there are different ways of living in this professional world, and I know some people, I think it's fantastic. They go around as individuals and they play with everybody, and it's always refreshing and new and energizing, and that's great.
You're a composer, you're a musician, but may be mistaken, but you also teach jazz.
I did.
How can...
I retired from that, though.
But maybe you will tell us about the jazz like a theory. How can jazz be taught?
Uncle Paul said this to me when I was a teenager. I don't remember exactly when. He said, jazz can be learned, but it can't be taught. So, now I don't think that's absolutely true, but I remembered that saying, and I think the answer to your question simply is that you don't think of it as something you directly teach. You think of it as creating a situation where jazz can be learned. And jazz can be learned when you have a lot of exposure to the music, when you have people who really want to progress in the music. It's hard to learn alone. It's quite different when you have a group of students together, you know, and they have to play the right instruments. And you create that situation, you give examples, you encourage people to learn, but also to be inventive. And so they learn, but they haven't been taught. No, I've taught many successful pianists. None of them sound like me. They sound like themselves. So, again, even one-to-one, I'm showing them how some things work, maybe, but I'm not having them copy me or copy any other models. I create the conditions for learning.
Oh, at the end of our interview, I want to make another link with jazz diplomacy. We know the relations between USA and Russia now are not so good as, for example, 15 years ago. Do you think that the jazz diplomacy can improve our relations again, now?
That's a tough question. Okay, I'll have it both ways and say yes and no. Let me start with the no part. No, because unlike the 50s or even the 80s, if people are interested in jazz, whether they're in Russia or Azerbaijan or wherever they are, they can find each other on the internet now. Travel is easier. People go to jazz festivals wherever they happen to be. So it's no longer a diplomatic breakthrough to have the Darius Brubeck Quartet in Russia. This is not a political event. Although it so happens we've talked about politics. So the no side is really to say, well, whatever can be achieved through jazz diplomacy has already happened. That is not a negative thing. I'm saying it still works, but it has worked. And the world is what it is now, which is different from what it was 60 years ago or even 30 years ago. The yes part is, again, it comes down to individuals. Yes, the political relations between Russia and the US and between Russia and
Western civilization.
Well, no, and I was going to say particularly the United Kingdom, which is where I'm based now. Okay, there is a lot of mistrust, but I think on the level of people, I don't any longer think that our nations will regard each other as enemies. I just don't see how that can happen. I disagree with everything Donald Trump stands for, but that doesn't make me an enemy of America. So if I disagree with what your president has done, that doesn't make me an enemy of Russia. And I think now the world is still liberal enough to understand a position like that.
Okay, thank you for your interview. It was very interesting to hear you. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you will enjoy Russia as Russians enjoy the USA.
Okay, thank you, Nikita.
Сегодня в гостях у программы «Час пик» был знаменитый джазовый музыкант Дариус Брубек. Спасибо. Thank you.
До свидания.